So I want to finish up this series on Ethernet, just talking a little bit about Ethernet cabling and sort of demystifying some of these terms like what's the difference between category 5 and category 6 cables, and what does it mean when I see 10 base T versus 100 base T4? What does all that mean? So that's what we're going to do in this wrap-up session here. So as I mentioned previously, when Ethernet first came out in the late 1970s, it used a very thick coaxial cabling. They actually called that thick net. And they came up with, after that, a thinner type of coaxial cable that was a little bit more flexible called thin net. But we don't use that anymore. As Ethernet evolved, it continued to operate over copper cable of various different types, as well as fiber optic cable, because by transmitting those ones and zeros as light pulses instead of electrical energy, you can actually transmit it faster and get more data through that cable if it's a fiber optic cable. So a lot of times you're going to see when referencing Ethernet, especially like Ethernet cables, you're going to see stuff like 100 base TX or 1000 base ZX or something like that. What does that mean? So let's break that down a little bit. So first of all, when you see something like that, the first number represents the speed. So 10 is 10 megabits per second, 100 megabits per second. And in terms of Ethernet, the next thing is always going to be the word base, 100 base, 1000 base, because Ethernet is what's called a baseband technology, which means that the transmitting device, the device that's sending, has full use of all the bandwidth of the cable. You can't divide it up and have 2 or 3 devices transmitting at the same time and using different frequencies or something. Ethernet doesn't support that. So baseband means one device is speaking, it's using all of the electrical energy on that cable. It has the cable reserved. And then the last section could either be a digit or a number or a value. So for example, if it's a digit, that represents the maximum cable length in meters. So for example, some of the older Ethernet was like 10 base 2. 10 base 2 was 10 megabit per second Ethernet baseband that could operate over a cable that was roughly 200 meters in length. Actually, it was supportive of about 185 meters. There was also 10 base 5, which was an Ethernet cable that was up to 500 meters in length. These days, typically you'll see like a letter there. For example, T means twisted cable. So if you see a letter, that's indicating the type of cable that you can use. So T or TX would be twisted pair cable, and in just a second I'm going to show you what that means. T4 and T2, which you won't see anymore, was using either copper cabling or also twisted pair, but doing the cabling a little bit different, a little bit of the signaling different. If you see something that's a letter other than the T, for example, ZX or LH, a lot of times that represents fiber optic cabling of some sort. Unless you see CX, C stands for copper cabling. So most variants of Ethernet these days have some sort of letter, which doesn't really tell you how long the cable is. It gives you more of a reference of what kind of cable you're using. In just a second, I'll show you a chart that shows you those various different types of cables and their maximum distances and everything like that. But the most common form of Ethernet you're going to see today in most local area networks where you're connecting laptops and PCs and servers into the network is what's called twisted pair cabling. So why do we call it twisted pair? Well, in twisted pair cabling, you have a pair of copper cables that are forming a complete electrical loop, right? So that you can send electrical energy around in this loop, much like we do in the telephone lines that connect to your telephone. So in this pair of cables, right? For example, in this case here, we have the transmitter on the left and the receiver on the right. One wire in the pair is sending the electrical current in one direction, and that's looping around and sending the electrical current back in the other direction. This creates an entire electrical circuit. So in a twisted pair cabling using Ethernet, the earliest forms of Ethernet specified you had to have at least 2 pairs of cables. So that means a total of 4 cables, 1 pair and 1 pair. Now, why do they call it twisted pair? Well, if these cables are running right next to each other, Because of the way electrical energy and magnetics and everything works along the cable, their electrical energy could actually influence each other. And scientists and physicists figured out a long time ago that if you take a pair of cables and you wrap them, you twist them among each other, it helps to mitigate or prevent this electromagnetic interference. So you don't have to worry so much about your ones and zeros being corrupted in one wire based on the ones and zeros being transmitted in the wire right next to it. So that's why we call it twisted pair. So up top here we show an example of what twisted pair cable looks like. Vast majority of twisted pair cabling you're going to see today, each individual cable is going to have an outer sheath of some sort of a color. And then every two cables are going to be twisted together. And so the colors just help you track the cables. And so that's what twisted pair cable would look like. Your most common type of Ethernet connector is what we call an RJ45. RJ stands for registered jack. Registered jack 45, and it looks like this. So you can see here inside the plastic RJ45, you can actually see the individual cables and their pins connected to on this jack. And I'll refer to that here in just one second. Another type of Ethernet connector is something called a small form factor pluggable, or an SFP, small form factor pluggable. And you're seeing a lot of these on the higher speed Ethernet connectors, especially like the gigabit and the 10 gigabit connections. A lot of those make use of SFPs as opposed to RJ45s because they're small, so you can cram more of these into the same space. You would have less RJ45s. So when it comes to twisted pair Ethernet cabling, so if you're actually going to be cabling something in a lab or at your house, you should be aware that twisted pair cable comes in two varieties. One is called straight through cable. So what you've got here is you're actually seeing your twisted pair cable opened up, and you're seeing the cables, the actual wires inside of it. So the vast majority of twisted pair cable these days comes with 8 wires, although only 4 of those wires are probably actually going to be used in your implementation of Ethernet. So if you were actually to make your own twisted pair cable, you could actually get away with just 4 wires instead of 8. But a lot of times you'll see 8 in here because the manufacturer of the twisted pair cable, they don't know what you're going to use it for. If they knew in advance that you're just going to use it for regular 10 megabit or 100 megabit Ethernet, they would just give you a cable that has 4 wires twisted into 2 pairs. But there's certain flavors of gigabit Ethernet that actually use 4 or even 8 pairs of wires. And so that's why most twisted pair cables these days will actually have all 8 wires in there. So straight through simply means that pin number 1 on one end of the cable goes straight to pin number 1 on the other end of the cable. Pin 2 goes to 2, 3 goes to 3, so on and so forth. So in other words, if I go back here, if you had an RJ45, if you had a cable, and you know that both ends of the cable are going to have an RJ45 connector, if you held those 2 RJ45 connectors right up next to each other and you looked at them in a straight through cable, if one RJ45 connector had, for example, red, green, blue in that order, the other RJ45 connector would also have red, green, blue in that order. So it's going straight through. A straight through cable is used when you're connecting devices that reside at different layers of the OSI model. What do I mean by that? Well, what layer of the OSI model would you typically put a switch? Most people would say layer 2, the data link layer. Whereas what layer would you put a router? Routers typically fall at layer 3. So those 2 devices are at different layers of the OSI model. So if I was connecting a switch to a router, I would use this. I would use a straight through cable. If I'm connecting a hub to a router, I would use a straight through cable. But if I'm connecting devices that are at the same layer, for example, if I want to connect a switch to another switch or router to another router, then I would use what's called a crossover cable. So devices at the same layer of the OSI model use crossover cables. And you can see this is why they call it crossover, because pin 1 on one side ends up at pin 3's position on the other. Pin 2 ends up at pin 6. And this actually is something that if you're studying for your Cisco CCNA, you would need to know. That a crossover cable, if you could remember 1 to 3, 2 to 6. So 1 goes to 3, 2 goes to 6. And this is for devices when you're connecting there at the same level of the OSI model, connecting a hub to a hub, a PC directly to another PC, a switch to a switch. You would need a crossover cable. Fortunately for us, a lot of networking devices these days, their networking adapters are what's called auto MDIX. And auto MDIX adapters actually are able to automatically detect the cable type. So even if you use the wrong cable, an auto MDIX adapter will be able to account for that. What about categories of cables? A lot of times when you go down to your Home Depot or Lowe's or some other electronic store to buy Ethernet cable that you want to build yourself, you'll see category 5, category 5E, category 6. What's that all mean? Well, each of these categories of cables are tested by standards bodies to see if they conform to certain stringent requirements. You know, they put certain voltage levels on there and they see what the voltage level comes out the other end. How attenuated was it? How modified was it? You know, they check the heat of the cable. They check all sorts of things. And so the category of the cable gives you an idea of how rigorously this cable has been tested to meet certain standards. And so typically speaking, we know that in twisted pair cable, you've got each pair of cables is twisted around each other. Well, one of the things that they measure is how many twists per centimeter is there. The more twists you have per centimeter, the less chance of electromagnetic interference. But think about the manufacturer of the cable. It's actually going to take them a little bit more work. Their machines have to be a little bit more complex to add more twists per centimeter, so they're going to charge you a little bit more for that. The sheath of the cable, you know, the outer ring of the cable, that rubber or plastic sheath, the thicker it is, the more it will prevent electromagnetic interference. So as far as categories of cables are concerned, the higher the number, the more twists per inch, the thicker the sheath of that cable. So here's actually a visual representation of this. So compare the category 5 cable on the top with the category 6 cable on the bottom, and you can clearly see that as far as twists per centimeter are concerned, the category 6 cable has a lot more twists in a shorter space, a shorter length, than the category 5. So that category 6 cable is going to be more expensive for you, but it will give you better electromagnetic interference. It'll prevent that electromagnetic interference from happening. So typically what you'll hear is that, you know, as far as the cabling that you're running from your laptop to your switch or your laptop to your router, a lower category of cable is fine because you're probably not going to experience electromagnetic interference. But if you're running cabling, for example, in a wall where there's probably also going to be electrical cables right next to it that's carrying high power electrical energy, well, you'll probably want cable that's of a higher category in that case because it's got more twists per inch. In addition to that, you can see here that the outer covering, the sheath, is thicker the higher you go up in your categories. So that's one thing that makes different twisted pair cables different from each other is the category, the 5, 5E, 6. It even goes higher than that, and I'll show you a chart here in just a moment. Another thing you can think of is when you're buying pre-made cables, pre-made Ethernet twisted pair cables, you might see some listed as shielded twisted pair and others as unshielded twisted pair. What's that referring to? Well, that's referring to yet another attempt to block out electromagnetic interference. So shielded twisted pair is going to be far more expensive, but that is blocking out a lot more electromagnetic interference. In shielded twisted pair, as you can see here, each pair of wires, not only is it twisting around itself, but there's an outer covering, usually like some sort of foil or some sort of mesh that's around each pair of wires to even give you more protection against electromagnetic interference. Whereas unshielded twisted pair doesn't really have that. So the moral of the story is if you're installing Ethernet cable next to something that has a lot of probability of electromagnetic interference, for example, you're installing it in a ceiling or in a wall that's right next to your power cables leading to your AC outlets and stuff in your wall, you're probably going to use the highest category you can afford and it's best to use shielded twisted pair if you can afford it. Whereas unshielded twisted pair is fine connecting from your laptop or your PCs to the switch or router that they're connected to. So here is that chart I promised to show you that shows you your different categories all the way up to category 8. When I was researching this, there may even be category 9 and 10 available now. I was not able to find any information on category 9 and 10, but I found some hints to it. So that might also be available. But you can see here that the length is pretty standard, except when you get up to category 8, that's pretty short. They all support 10 megabits and 100 megabits, but when you get up into the higher speeds, for example, 40 gigs, we need category 8 cable to support 40 gigs. And that concludes this session on Ethernet. So that being the case, I hope this series of videos on Ethernet has been useful and beneficial to you. I hope you're able to use it in your studies and as you move forward into the networking world, and I hope to see you again in our next session of INE videos. Thank you.